Welcome to month 2 of the Senior Copilot Studio admin track. Last month you built the architectural foundation, environments, the admin center, licensing, RBAC. Today you use that foundation to do governance work that directly reduces organizational risk. DLP policies and connector governance are where administration becomes security architecture. A misconfigured data group classification or a missing endpoint filter is not a cosmetic problem. It is a control failure that can allow unauthenticated agents to access internal APIs, allow agents to ground on public internet sources in regulated environments, or allow arbitrary outbound HTTP calls with no audit trail. By the end of this session, you will have authored policies, configured endpoint filters, implemented multiple authentication modes, troubleshot DLP enforcement errors, and documented a coherent tenant security design. These are deliverables you could take into a production engagement next week. 4 hours, 4 blocks. Hour 1 covers the DLP foundations you need before you can author any policy. Data group classification, policy scope, enforcement precedents, and the MC 973,179 exemption removal that went into effect in early 2025. The Meridian Financial Services scenario runs throughout the session. By the end of Hour 1, you will have diagnosed 3 live DLP violations and designed their remediations. Hour 2 is the 7 DLP use cases and endpoint filtering. These are the building blocks of every DLP policy you will author for Copilot Studio. The hour ends with a hands-on workshop where you configure endpoint filtering for SharePoint and HTTP connectors in your developer tenant. Hour 3 shifts to authentication. 4 authentication modes, required user sign-in, the access control matrix, and SSO configuration for Microsoft Teams. The Hour 3 lab is the Meridian Authentication Matrix. 4 tasks, each mapping a different agent to the correct authentication mode with the correct access controls. Hour 4 is troubleshooting and presentations. You learn the 3 DLP troubleshooting tools, work through the common pitfalls, and 2 volunteers present their Meridian DLP design to the group for peer feedback. 5 objectives, each measurable and each building directly on the last. The first objective is to design DLP policies that correctly classify Copilot Studio connectors into business, non-business, and block data groups. By the end of this session, you will be able to look at any Meridian scenario and identify exactly which connector to move and where. The second objective is to apply all 7 DLP use cases to restrict specific capabilities in a regulated tenant. The 7 use cases are the vocabulary you will use with business stakeholders to explain what DLP policies can and cannot control. The third objective is to configure endpoint filtering for SharePoint, web, and HTTP connectors. Endpoint filtering is the surgical tool. When you want a connector in the business group, but only for certain data sources, endpoint filtering is how you achieve that without blocking the connector entirely. The fourth objective is to implement agent-level authentication using all 4 modes and document the access control implications of each. The documentation requirement is not optional. The assessment requires a complete authentication matrix, not just a working configuration. The fifth objective is to troubleshoot DLP enforcement failures using the 3 tools available: error banners, the download details report, and the set power app DLP error settings PowerShell CMDLet. When a maker comes to you with a blocked agent and no idea why, these 3 tools give you the answer in under 5 minutes. Before you can author a single DLP policy, you need to have the data group model completely internalized. There are 4 data groups and 2 of them carry implications that are not obvious until you see them cause a production problem. Business is the group for connectors that your organization trusts to share data with each other. SharePoint, Dataverse, Teams, Exchange, Outlook. These are corporate data flows. A connector in the business group can pass data to any other connector in the business group within the same policy scope. Non-business is the group for connectors isolated from business connectors. Personal or consumer services, Twitter, Gmail, Dropbox, personal OneDrive, belong here. A connector in non-business cannot share data with connectors in business, and vice versa. The two groups are walled off from each other within a given policy scope. Blocked is the group for connectors that are entirely prohibited. No agent or flow within the policy scope can use a blocked connector under any conditions. Unclassified is the critical default state, and it is the group that creates ongoing maintenance work. Any new connector added to the Power Platform connector catalog after a policy is created defaults to non-business. This means a connector published a month after your policy was created lands in the non-business group silently. You must actively monitor for new connectors and classify them intentionally. This is not a one-time exercise. It is a recurring administrative responsibility. The precedence rule is absolute. Blocked beats business beats non-business. There is no override and no exception at the policy level. If two policies apply to the same environment and one classifies a connector as blocked, while the other classifies it as business, blocked wins. Policy stacking is always additive restriction, never relaxation. You have two scope options for every DLP policy you author, and the choice between them is architectural. A tenant-wide policy applies to every environment, including any environment created after the policy is published. This is your baseline security floor. Use it for requirements that must be true everywhere. All agents must require authentication. High-risk connectors are blocked tenant-wide. No public web knowledge sources in any environment. The tenant-wide policy establishes the minimum. Nothing can relax it. An environment-specific policy applies only to the environments you explicitly list. Use it to layer stricter rules on top of the tenant-wide baseline for regulated environments. Your regulated production environment may need to block SharePoint access in addition to the tenant-wide rules. Your environment-specific policy handles that without affecting development or sandbox environments. Policy stacking is the key behavior to understand deeply. Multiple policies can apply to the same environment simultaneously. The most restrictive classification for any given connector wins across all applicable policies. If the tenant-wide policy places a connector in business and an environment-specific policy places it in blocked, the result in that environment is blocked. MC 973179 is a real production concern. In early 2025, Microsoft removed support for DLP exemptions. Any agent in your tenant that was relying on a DLP exemption, explicitly excluded from enforcement, will now display error banners. If you are inheriting a tenant from a previous administrator, run the download details report for all policies before your first governance review. Exemption-dependent agents need remediation before the enforcement window closes. The trade-off is worth naming clearly. Tenant-wide policies are operationally simpler, one policy to maintain, universal coverage. Environment-specific policies provide flexibility for regulated workloads, but create maintenance overhead as your environment estate grows. A mature governance model uses both. A lean tenant-wide baseline plus environment-specific additive policies for workloads that require stricter controls. This connector reference is the most practical asset in this session. Every DLP policy you author for a Copilot Studio environment will involve one or more of these connectors. There are 9 connectors specific to Copilot Studio in the DLP catalog, and every single one defaults to non-business when a new policy is created. The Copilot Studio connector for required authentication controls whether agents can operate with no authentication. Moving it to business signals that all agents must require user authentication. Blocking it withdraws the no-auth option from the maker experience. Makers can no longer publish anonymous agents within this policy scope. The skills connector controls whether agents can invoke skills. subordinate agents, or function capabilities. Blocking it in a regulated environment prevents makers from chaining agents together in ways that might bypass other controls. The SharePoint Knowledge Connector controls SharePoint and OneDrive as knowledge sources. For a regulated environment, either move it to business with an endpoint filter restricting which SharePoint sites are allowed, or block it entirely. Be aware that this is a distinct connector from the general SharePoint connector. They are separate entries in the catalog, and endpoint filtering must be applied to each independently. The Web Search Knowledge Connector controls public website and Bing grounding. In any regulated financial services or healthcare environment, this should be blocked. Agents grounding on public data can surface information that contradicts internal disclosures or violates information barrier requirements. The File Upload Knowledge Connector controls uploaded files as a knowledge source. Block it in regulated environments where content governance requires all knowledge to come from approved repositories rather than ad hoc uploads. The HTTP Requests Connector controls outbound HTTP calls from agents to any endpoint. This is the most sensitive connector in the catalog because it can reach any internet-accessible API. Either block it entirely or move it to business with an endpoint filter that enumerates the approved hosts. The Channel Publishing Connector controls which channels agents can be activated on. Block it in restricted environments to prevent publication to unapproved channels. The Event Triggers Connector controls autonomous and event-driven agent behavior. Block it in environments where only interactive, user-initiated conversations are permitted. The HTTP with Microsoft Entra ID pre-authorized connector governs authenticated HTTP calls to internal APIs. The recommended configuration is business group with an endpoint filter, providing authenticated HTTP capability while still constraining which hosts are reachable. The connector reference gives you the building blocks. The 7 use cases tell you when to deploy each one and what the effect is. Use case 1 is require authentication. Move the Copilot Studio requires authentication connector to blocked. This withdraws the no-auth option from the agent settings interface. Makers can no longer publish anonymous agents within this policy scope. It does not block agents entirely. It blocks the permission that allows no-auth configuration. This distinction is important and it is frequently misunderstood. Use case 2 is block SharePoint knowledge. Move the SharePoint knowledge connector to blocked. Agents within scope can no longer add SharePoint or OneDrive as a knowledge source. Existing agents with SharePoint knowledge already configured will display error banners and may fail at runtime. Use case 3 is block public web knowledge. Move the Web Search Knowledge Connector to blocked. Agents within scope can no longer use public websites or Bing as a grounding source. This is mandatory in any regulated environment where information barriers or disclosure controls apply. Use case 4 is block file upload knowledge. Move the File Upload Knowledge Connector to blocked. File uploads as a knowledge source are removed from the maker experience. Use this when your content governance policy requires all knowledge to come from cataloged repositories. Use case 5 is block HTTP requests. Move the HTTP requests connector to blocked. All HTTP request nodes and agents within scope will fail at runtime. If some HTTP calls are acceptable, use endpoint filtering rather than outright blocking. Move the connector to business and add an allow list of approved hosts. Use case 6 is block skills. Move the skills connector to blocked. Agents within scope cannot invoke skills. Use this when agent composition creates governance risk by allowing makers to construct multi-agent pipelines that might bypass individual agent restrictions. Use case 7 is block channels and event triggers. Move the channel publishing and event triggers connectors to blocked. This prevents makers from activating specific channels or creating autonomous event-driven agents. Use this to enforce that agents operate only interactively within approved channels. Endpoint filtering is the surgical tool that allows you to place a connector in the business group, meaning it is permitted, while still restricting which specific endpoints that connector can reach. It answers the question. You want to allow SharePoint access, but only to approved site collections, not to every site in the tenant. The SharePoint connector with endpoint filtering accepts an allow list of site collection URLs or tenant URLs. Any SharePoint URL not on the allow list is blocked even though the connector is in the business group. Remember that this is the SharePoint General Connector, not the SharePoint Knowledge Connector. They are separate entries and filtering must be configured on each independently. The public website connector with endpoint filtering accepts an allow list of approved domains. If a regulated environment has one approved public data source, an industry data feed, or a regulatory reference site, you can allow exactly that domain while blocking all other public websites. The HTTP connector with endpoint filtering accepts allowed host patterns using wildcard notation. For Meridian Financial Services, the appropriate configuration allows their internal API host names, API, Meridians, COM, and internal API, Meridians, COM, while blocking all external hosts. Any HTTP request node that attempts to call an unlisted host fails at runtime with a policy enforcement error. The correct use case for endpoint filtering is when a connector should be permitted for some data sources, but not others. It is more surgical than full connector blocking and allows you to preserve legitimate business use of a connector while bounding it to approved data sources. When in doubt about whether to block a connector or filter it, consider whether any legitimate use case for that connector exists within the environment. If yes, filter. If no, block. Meridian Financial Services has 3 active DLP violations in their tenant. Each one represents a real governance failure with a real blast radius. Violation 1 is an unauthenticated customer-facing agent. The Copilot Studio requires authentication connector is sitting in non-business, the default state. That means any maker in the tenant can publish an agent that allows anonymous users to interact with it, including agents that connect to internal data APIs. The blast radius is significant. An unauthenticated agent with access to internal systems is an open door to any user who can reach the agent URL. The remediation is to move the connector to blocked. Because the requirement, no anonymous agents, applies everywhere in the tenant, this fix belongs in a tenant-wide policy. Violation 2 is a public web knowledge source in the regulated production environment. The Web Search Knowledge Connector is in non-business, not blocked, and is active in the production environment. Agents are grounding on Bing, which can surface public financial information that contradicts internal disclosures. In a financial services firm, this can constitute an information barrier violation. The remediation is to move the connector to blocked, because no environment in a financial services tenant should be grounding on public web data. A tenant-wide policy scope is the appropriate choice. Violation 3 is unconstrained HTTP requests to external APIs. The HTTP requests connector is in non-business without any endpoint filtering. Agents can call any internet-accessible API, and there is no audit trail in compliance reports for these calls. The blast radius includes data exfiltration risk and uncontrolled API cost consumption. The remediation depends on whether HTTP access is legitimately needed. If yes, move the connector to business and add an endpoint filter restricting to approved internal hosts. If no HTTP access should be permitted at all, block the connector outright. For each violation, the remediation decision requires 2 choices: which connector to move, and what scope, tenant-wide or environment-specific, is appropriate for the fix. The scope choice is not cosmetic. Tenant-wide means every present and future environment is covered by this rule. Environment-specific means only the environments you name are affected. Copilot Studio supports 5 authentication configurations across 4 authentication modes. Understanding the access control implications of each is essential before you configure authentication in the lab. No authentication means anyone with the agent link can interact without signing in. Anonymous access is fully open. Guest users are allowed because there is no identity check at all. Required sign-in is not applicable because the mode is inherently unauthenticated. Use this only for genuinely public-facing agents where no internal data is accessible and no user-specific context is needed. Entra ID Teams Native provides SSO through the caller's Teams identity. No app registration is required. The Teams channel handles identity resolution natively. Guest users are blocked because Copilot Studio enforces a platform-level guest restriction regardless of authentication mode. Required sign-in is supported. This is the correct mode for internal Teams deployed agents, where you want zero additional sign-in friction for employees. Entra ID v2 User Delegated requires an explicit Entra ID app registration and supports the token exchange URL for Teams SSO. Guest users are blocked by the same platform restriction. Required sign-in is supported. Use this mode when you need to grant specific API permissions in the app registration, Microsoft Graph, SharePoint, or custom APIs registered in Entra, so that the agent can act on behalf of the authenticated user. Entra ID v2 service principle is non-interactive. The agent acts with its own identity rather than delegating to a user. There is no user context, so guest user access and required sign-in are both not applicable. Use this for background agents, scheduled processes, and integrations where no human user drives the conversation. Generic OAuth 2 supports any OAuth 2 compliant identity provider, Okta, Auth0, Google Workspace, or any custom provider. Guest users are blocked by the platform restriction regardless of which OAuth 2 provider is configured. Required sign-in is supported. Use this in environments where the identity provider is not Entra ID. The platform restriction applies universally. Guest users cannot authenticate to Copilot Studio regardless of which authentication mode is chosen. This is not configurable. No authentication mode, no sharing configuration, and no workaround within Copilot Studio will bypass this restriction. It is a platform-level control, and it must be communicated clearly to makers before they design agent architectures that might depend on guest access. Required user sign-in is a setting on the agent, not on the DLP policy. It works in concert with DLP to enforce access controls at the individual agent level. When required user sign-in is enabled on an agent, anonymous access is entirely disabled for that agent. Every user who attempts to start a conversation must authenticate. This is the per-agent enforcement layer, and it sits on top of the DLP policy that governs what connectors the agent can use. The Share panel in Copilot Studio is the access control surface for who can interact with an authenticated agent. Sharing with specific users or security groups means only the listed identities can interact. This is the tightest control and the correct setting for internal agents that should only be accessible to specific teams. Sharing with the entire organization means any authenticated member of the tenant can interact, appropriate for all employee agents like HR help desks or IT support agents. Having no sharing entries means nobody can interact with the agent except admins, the correct state for an agent under development or recently cloned. A distinction that matters. Sharing an agent grants interaction rights only. A user who has been granted access through the Share panel cannot author the agent, cannot see it in the Copilot Studio portal, and cannot change any of its settings. They can only converse with it. Portal access and authoring rights require explicit maker role assignment. The guest user restriction applies regardless of sharing configuration. Even if an agent is shared with the entire organization, a guest user account will be blocked when it attempts to interact. This is a platform restriction that no sharing setting can override. SSO for Microsoft Teams eliminates the authentication friction that would otherwise occur every time an employee starts a conversation with a Teams deployed agent. When configured correctly, the agent picks up the caller's Teams identity automatically. No additional sign-in prompt, No extra credentials to enter. The configuration has 5 steps and they must be completed in the correct order. Step 1. Create an Entra ID app registration. In the Entra Admin Center, create a new app registration for the agent. Set the redirect URI for the Teams application and note the application client ID. You will need it in the final step. Step 2. Set the token exchange URL in Copilot Studio. Navigate to the agent settings, then security, then authentication. Choose Entra ID v2 and paste the token exchange URL. The token exchange URL format is API//boated followed by the bot's application ID GUID. For example, API//boated A1B2C3D4E5F6-7890 app def 1,234,567,890. This URL tells the Teams channel which app registration to use for the token exchange. Step 3. Grant admin consent. In the app registration, grant admin consent for the OpenID and profile scopes at minimum, plus any additional API permissions the agent requires. Admin consent prevents individual users from being prompted to consent to permissions. In an enterprise context, user consent prompts are a poor user experience and a governance gap. Step 4. Configure the Teams channel. In the Teams channel settings for the agent, paste the same token exchange URL from Step 2. Both the agent authentication settings and the Teams channel settings must reference the same token exchange URL. If they differ, SSO will not work. Step 5. Validate in Teams. Test the agent in the Teams application. The agent should pick up the caller's Teams identity and begin the conversation without prompting for a separate sign-in. If the user is prompted for credentials, the most common cause is that the token exchange URL is either missing or mismatched between the agent's security settings and the Teams channel settings. There is no error message indicating this mismatch. The Teams channel simply falls back to prompting for credentials silently. The Hour 3 lab has 4 tasks, each corresponding to a different Meridian agent with a different authentication requirement. Task A is the HR internal agent. This agent is deployed in Teams and used exclusively by Meridian's HR department. The correct authentication mode is Entra ID Teams native, no app registration required. Required user sign-in must be enabled, and the agent must be shared with the HR security group only. The expected outcome is that only HR group members can start conversations with the agent when accessed through Teams. Task B is the customer portal agent. This agent is customer-facing and needs to authenticate users through a custom Entra ID app registration. The correct authentication mode is Entra ID v2 with user-delegated authentication. You create the app registration in the Entra Admin Center. Configure the token exchange URL in the agent's security settings and validate that the agent is accessible and authenticates correctly. Task C is guest access validation. You invite a guest user account to the tenant or use an existing guest account. You attempt to access any Copilot Studio agent with the guest account and document the error message that appears. The expected outcome is that access is blocked regardless of the agent's sharing settings and regardless of which authentication mode the agent uses. Task D is Teams SSO. Using the token exchange URL from the app registration created in Task B, you configure SSO for the Teams channel. You test the sign-in flow in Teams and confirm that the agent picks up the Teams identity without prompting for a separate sign-in. You capture a screenshot of the security panel showing SSO active. At the end of Hour 3, you should be able to show the screenshots from these 4 tasks and describe the access control decision that determined which authentication mode was correct for each agent scenario. When a maker comes to you with a DLP problem, 3 tools give you a complete diagnosis in under 5 minutes. Every senior administrator needs to know these tools by name and know exactly when to use each one. The first tool is the error banner in Copilot Studio. When a DLP policy violation is detected on an agent, the authoring canvas displays a banner that identifies the blocked connector and the name of the policy that triggered enforcement. The banner is your first stop. It tells you exactly which connector classification change is needed to resolve the violation. Read the banner text before looking anywhere else. The second tool is the Download Details report in the Power Platform Admin Center. Navigate to Data Policies, select the relevant policy, and click Download Details. The report exports as a CSV listing every resource in scope and its compliance state. It shows which agents are non-compliant and which specific connector triggered the violation for each agent. The error banner shows you one agent's problem. The Download Details report shows you the entire affected population in a single export. This is the audit artifact you need for governance reviews and for evidence when regulators ask about DLP compliance posture. The third tool is the Set Power App DLP Error Settings PowerShell CMDlet. This CMDlet configures a custom admin contact message and a Learn More URL that appear inside the error banner displayed to makers. Instead of a generic platform error, makers see your admin team's contact email and a link to your organization's DLP remediation documentation. This transforms the error experience from a dead end into a self-service path that reduces help desk ticket volume and gets makers unblocked faster. The PowerShell pattern is straightforward. You call Set Power App DLP Error Settings with a tenant ID and an error settings object containing the message and the URL. Always follow with Get Power App DLP Error Settings to verify that the settings applied correctly. The Verify After Apply discipline is as important here as it was for governance flags in month 1. 5 pitfalls drawn from real support tickets and real governance failures. 2 of them have been mentioned already in this session. The repetition is deliberate. The first pitfall is choosing the wrong connector for the Require Authentication use case. When the goal is to enforce that all agents require authentication, the correct action is to move only the Copilot Studio Requires Authentication connector to blocked. Blocking all Copilot Studio connectors disables agents entirely. Moving that one specific connector withdraws the no-auth option without affecting any other capability. The second pitfall is misunderstanding how tenant-wide and environment-specific policies interact. Environment-specific policies cannot override a tenant-wide policy in a permissive direction. Policy stacking is always additive restriction. If the tenant-wide policy blocks a connector, no environment-specific policy can unblock it for a particular environment. The only path to a more permissive state is changing the tenant-wide policy itself, and that change affects every environment it covers. The third pitfall is applying endpoint filtering to the wrong SharePoint connector. Applying endpoint filtering to the SharePoint general connector in the expectation that it will restrict SharePoint knowledge source URLs will not work. The SharePoint knowledge connector and the SharePoint general connector are separate entries in the DLP catalog. Endpoint filtering must be applied to the correct connector for each capability being restricted. The fourth pitfall is assuming that generic OAuth 2 will allow guest access because the identity is managed by an external provider. The guest restriction is a Copilot Studio platform restriction, not an authentication provider setting. No authentication mode, Entra ID, generic OAuth 2, or any other will bypass it. The fifth pitfall is omitting the token exchange URL from the Teams channel settings after configuring it on the agent. Teams SSO silently falls back to prompting users for credentials when the token exchange URL is missing or mismatched. There is no error message to alert you to this problem. If SSO is not working as expected, the first thing to verify is whether the token exchange URL is present in both the agent security settings and the Teams channel settings. For every DLP policy you author, document the scope choice, the connector classifications, the endpoint filter rules, and the business risk that each decision addresses. This documentation is required for audit evidence and for any administrator who inherits your tenant in the future. In this workshop, you build a real DLP policy with endpoint filters and publish it to your developer tenant. The 5 steps give you direct hands-on experience with the configuration path you have been working through conceptually. Step 1. Navigate to Data Policies in the Power Platform Admin Center. Go to Admin, Power Platform, Microsoft. Then Policies, then Data Policies, then New Policy. Name the policy following a consistent naming convention. Step 2. Assign the policy scope. Select your developer environment specifically. Selecting all environments for a lab exercise risks affecting your month 1 environment configuration and requires time to unwind. Step 3. Classify the SharePoint Knowledge connector. Find Copilot Studio SharePoint Knowledge in the connector list and move it from non-business to business. Once it is in the business group, the endpoint filtering option becomes available. Add your tenant SharePoint URL as the only allowed URL. All other SharePoint URLs will be blocked by this filter, even though the connector itself is permitted. Step 4. Configure the HTTP connector endpoint filter. Find Copilot Studio HTTP requests and move it to business. Add an allow rule for one approved internal host. Any HTTP request node calling a host not on the allow list will fail at runtime. Step 5. Save and validate. Publish the policy. Open a test agent in your developer environment and attempt to add a knowledge source using a SharePoint URL that is not in your allow list. Observe the error banner that appears. Screenshot the banner. It is a required component of the session deliverable. After the workshop, the key trade-off to consider is this. A tenant-wide broad safety net provides simpler governance, but reduces maker flexibility across all environments. Environment-specific policies preserve flexibility but require careful policy maintenance as the environment estate grows. When you stack multiple policies, the most restrictive classification always wins. When a legitimate SharePoint connector is caught by a blanket block, the correct answer is to create an environment-specific policy that moves the connector to business with an endpoint filter, not to relax the tenant-wide policy. 4 deliverables, equal weight, each testing a different dimension of what you covered today. The DLP policy configuration deliverable requires evidence of correct connector classification, appropriate policy scope selection for each of Meridian's 3 violations, and endpoint filter rules applied where appropriate. This is not a narrative description. It requires screenshots from the Power Platform Admin Center showing connector classifications and scope settings, along with the error banner screenshot from the workshop exercise. The Authentication Matrix document maps all 5 authentication modes to business scenarios with validated test results and screenshots per mode. The matrix should show the mode, the scenario it was applied to, the access control outcome, and the guest user restriction validation from Task C. This is a structured document, not a list of observations. A reader should be able to understand both what was configured and why each choice was made for the corresponding scenario. The endpoint filtering and troubleshooting report documents your PowerShell CMDLET usage for set Power App DLP error settings, your error banner analysis from the workshop, and the admin contact configuration. Structure it as a remediation guide a maker could follow, not internal admin notes. A maker receiving this guide should be able to understand the DLP violation, know what the admin team expects them to do, and know how to reach the admin team for help. The Tenant Security Design presentation is the Hour 4 deliverable. It presents a coherent, justified DLP and authentication architecture for Meridian Financial Services. It should cover the DLP policy structure, the connector classifications, the authentication mode decisions for each agent type, and the risk trade-off rationale for the key choices made. 2 volunteers present in Hour 4 with rubric-guided peer feedback. Month 3 is agent building and lifecycle management. The governance controls you put in place today are the enforcement layer that shapes what makers can build in Month 3. Offline milestones are distributed at the close of this session to establish the pre-work for Month 3. Month 2 is complete. DLP policies authored. authentication modes configured, endpoint filters deployed. Meridian Financial Services is now DLP compliant in your lab tenant and with the pattern knowledge to replicate that compliance in any production tenant. The work you did today is production grade. The connector classification decisions, the endpoint filter patterns, the authentication mode selections, the troubleshooting workflow, all of it applies directly to a real enterprise tenant. The difference between a well-governed Copilot Studio estate and one that creates compliance exposure often comes down to exactly the connector classifications and endpoint filters you configured today. Submit your 4 deliverables before month 3 begins. The details are in your challenge brief. Month 3 is agent building and lifecycle management. The governance you configured in month 1 and month 2 is the container that month 3 works inside. When you build and publish agents in month 3, the DLP policies you designed today are actively enforcing. That is the point. Governance is not theoretical. It is the operating environment that shapes everything makers build.